Hello, Endeavor here. It goes without saying that 2020 has been the most chaotic year in living memory. From the global pandemic to civil unrest, from political polarization to economic depression, everyone, regardless of political leaning, agrees that 2020 was a year of massive upheaval. But what should the major takeaway from this year be? How can we make sense of all the chaos, and what insight can it give us into the future? Anyone who has followed my channel for any period of time will know that I'm a major critic of the system of liberal democracy under which the Western world is governed. I've made numerous videos attacking the false premises that it's based on and the destructive nature of liberalism. I'm not one to feel vindicated by predicting something negative would happen and then see that prediction come into fruition, but when considering the events of the past year, the effects that it's had on the Western world, and the situation going into next year, I can't help but feel that many of the critiques of liberal democracy that I've made have been proven correct this year. My major takeaway from 2020 is that it was the year where the façade which the liberal system relies on for its legitimacy finally fell, and where all the falsehoods it's based on showed themselves for all to see. Since the Second World War, the United States' claim to legitimacy as a world superpower has been the liberal democratic Enlightenment ideals it upholds at home and across the world. For the last 75 years as a superpower, the United States has been a beacon for freedom, equality, and democracy, which the rest of the Western world has followed. Within the last 2 decades, the United States' prestige on the world stage has declined, but the year 2020 has been the biggest blow of all. And I believe that this is the year that should prove the liberal democratic Enlightenment values upheld by both America and the rest of the Western liberal democracies to be illegitimate. To show why, I want to go over several of the major claims to legitimacy made by the system of Western liberal democracy and show how, in this past year alone, this very system has violated all of its supposed values. Now, this is mainly going to be focused on the United States, but it's applicable to other countries as well. I also want to make it clear that I'm referring to these promises in principle, because many of the actions I'm going to refer to were brought about through the legal process, but they really do violate the spirit of the principle. So we're looking at de facto, not necessarily de jure. I also need to make it clear that many of these liberal values which I believe have been violated in 2020, I myself have criticized in the past. I want to make it clear that I am not a liberal and this is not me endorsing liberal values. Instead, I want to hold liberalism to its own standards and undermine the continued perception of its legitimacy. First, I want to look at the concept of civil liberties and individual rights. The root word of liberalism is liberty, and one of the major claims to its legitimacy is that it makes the individual free by granting them a set of rights under the law, which the government is not allowed to violate. This is how liberalism supposedly gives the individual liberty. But what we've seen over the past year is that not only can the governments of the Western democracies exert complete control over the populace, they will. The West in the past year has seen what must be the strictest restrictions on the day-to-day life of the individual that the world has ever seen during this COVID pandemic. Now, I want to be clear that the virus does in fact exist and that I do acknowledge people have died from it. I don't deny that. I also do believe that the government enforcing certain public health policies is reasonable, especially during a pandemic. But the extent to which the state has imposed itself on the day-to-day lives of the people has been unbelievable. Back in April, many countries banned their citizens from leaving their own places of residence, which showed that the state can in fact wield absolute power if it chooses to do so. The notion that in the liberal West, the power of the government is limited is a fiction. Now, to be fair, back in April, I was saying that we should err on the side of caution and take the virus seriously since we didn't know the effects yet. But since then, we've learned that the death rate for healthy people under the age of 70 is far less than 1%. And while everyone might not be locked in their homes anymore, Western governments are still imposing asinine and seemingly contradictory restrictions on the everyday lives of their populace. Now, again, I want to stress that I'm not opposed to public health policies to prevent illness in theory, but I think most of them, in this case, have not been appropriate. The opportunity costs of the measures that have been imposed during the COVID pandemic have far outweighed the benefits. Many of them are just completely useless and only seem like an excuse to interfere in the people's day-to-day lives. Like putting tape on park benches to stop people from sitting beside each other, or preventing retail stores from selling certain items while allowing them to sell others in the exact same store. So you can sell pasta, but you can't sell birthday cards in the same damn store. I actually got the chance to experience the restrictions outside the West at a point this year. The response to COVID was nowhere nearly as hysterical and overbearing on your day-to-day routine as it was in countries like Canada or America. These extreme, minute regulations on day-to-day life have now become commonplace in Western liberal democracies. And that should really bring into question to what extent people really do have the liberty that liberalism claims to award them. The state is now in absolutely everything. And we have to remember that the response to COVID didn't start out like this. If it was such a big threat, these Western regimes at the beginning of the year in February and March weren't taking it seriously at all. Flights out of China into the West continued, and they said anyone who's the least bit concerned about it was racist against Chinese people. But then in mid-March, they flipped on a dime and went from one extreme to the other. These Western regimes went from telling you to go hug a Chinese person to prove how not racist you are, to telling you that in order to stop the spread of COVID, you need to wear a mask while having sex. It was just a complete failure on every level. Now, even in a liberal context where people have supposed rights, depriving them of certain civil liberties at a time of crisis has not always been considered illegitimate. Fighting COVID has been made a moral equivalency to war, and the restrictions legitimize themselves through that. That the suspension of liberal rights is in order to make the public safe. But another crisis in 2020 exposes how the pretenses under which these severe clampdowns were justified are not legitimate. Another major claim to legitimacy of liberal democracy, which was utterly trampled upon in 2020, is the rule of law. The principle of rule of law states that all members of society are to be held accountable to the law, that no one is above the law, and that the law should be enforced fairly. But in 2020, we've seen perhaps the most egregious violations of this principle in living memory. I'm referring to the BLM movement and the violent demonstrations that raged across America in the summer of 2020, which also spilled over into other Western countries. But it's not necessarily the riots themselves that are the most damning to the legitimacy of liberalism. What is so shocking is the complicity of the authorities in them. In 2020, we saw countless examples of the authorities simply allowing, or in some cases actively participating in wanton violations of the law. Be it law enforcement standing down and allowing looting, arson, and in some cases violence, rogue DAs refusing to prosecute criminals, or rogue judges just letting convicts off the hook. There were countless criminals from this past summer who will face absolutely no consequences for their actions. In the United States, and increasingly so in other Western countries, rule of law is dead. There are certain laws that simply don't apply to certain people. Here are some of the most egregious examples of this. The mayor of Minneapolis ordered police to abandon their precinct and simply surrender it to rioters, allowing them to burn down the police station. In Portland, you had the mayor take the side of rioters who tried to burn down a federal courthouse against the National Guard. And what you also saw in Portland was Antifa members getting arrested for rioting only to be immediately released without charge just to join the riots again. But the most insane example came from Seattle, where 6 city blocks were taken over by anarchists who declared the region to be a sovereign entity. Obviously, this was completely illegal, but the mayor and the police did absolutely nothing about it for 3 weeks. Over that time in these 6 city blocks, which became known as Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone or CHAZ, there were massive reports of rape, assault, and vandalism. There were also several shootings and 2 murders, something the authorities just allowed to happen. Historically, rulers have often been placed above the law, and it's the principle of rule of law which has been used to hold them accountable. Now, I'd argue that the oligarchs in the Western world today are above the law, and there's many things they should be getting thrown in jail for, but this always happens behind closed doors, and you only ever hear about it on WikiLeaks. The difference is, this year, we've seen wanton violations of rule of law in the streets for all to see. The violations of rule of law in America seem to have a racial and ideological underpinning. The cause that is known as anti-racism, but really should just be called anti-whiteism, is placed above the law. Fighting waithism has been established as a moral equivalency of war and justifies the violation of almost any law short of murder. Anyone who is working towards an anti-white agenda, they could be non-whites or white leftists, are above certain laws. While whites, and in some cases non-whites who resist this agenda, are not afforded protection from the law and are cracked down on relentlessly. So both fighting COVID and fighting racism have been declared morally equivalent to war. Now let's look at these demonstrations in the context of the COVID lockdowns, which took place before and after the summer of unrest. I know that this is the most obvious take in the world, but just days after it had been illegal for 10 people to gather together in a park, demonstrations with tens of thousands of people were allowed to just go ahead with complete institutional support across the board. So even the extreme restrictions on liberal rights in the name of public health was superseded by anti-white ideology. Fighting a supposed pandemic was deemed not as important as fighting racism. Secondly, the extreme restrictions proved that there was absolutely no excuse for the response, or lack thereof, by law enforcement to the illegal unrest that happened in the summer. They were fully capable of confining the population to their homes for weeks on end. But when real lawlessness took place and they were fully within their right to use force, they stood down. So it's not that the state cannot uphold the law, it's that it consciously chooses not to. This year saw the full realization of anarcho-tyranny, a system which refuses to police criminals and instead cracks down on the law-abiding, all in pursuit of ideology. In 2020, the United States saw the worst of anarchy and the worst of tyranny in the history of the country. No more liberty and no more rule of law. The next promise of liberal democracy to be shattered in 2020 was the promise of free, fair, and transparent elections. The idea is that liberal democracy is a system which allows for the peaceful transfer of political office from one elected official to another. But before the American election in November, the country had seen the largest purchase of firearms in 1 year in its history. Businesses in major cities were being boarded up in anticipation for the fallout after the election, and there was already talk among both sides of what-if scenarios for the aftermath. Nobody expected the process to be legitimate and the transfer of power to be peaceful. Everyone in America expected the outcome of the election to be something resembling that of a banana republic. Now, as for the election itself, as per YouTube's new policies on information regarding the election, I am not making any claims about the results of the election or the legitimacy of them. Instead, I'll link you to a video by Vincent James of the Red Elephants on BitChute about this, and I encourage you to consider both this video and the YouTube approved sources and decide for yourself what you wish to believe. The very fact that I need to make such a statement is indicative of another promise of liberal democracy which has been trampled on in 2020 as well. It's becoming increasingly obvious that free speech is a thing of the past in the Western world. All the major tech platforms where almost all public discourse is conducted today are brazenly partisan, and more than happy to remove information and opinions they consider to be undesirable. Likewise, those who express opinions contrary to those promoted by the oligarchs are increasingly under threat of loss of employment, character assassination, or leftist mob violence. But these liberal regimes have an out because legally the right to free speech only places limitations on the actions of the government, while all the aforementioned methods of suppression of speech are done by private organizations and individuals. There are some countries, but the United States isn't one of them, that do have hate speech laws which are a direct violation of the principles of freedom of expression on the part of the state. But the bulk of the suppression of ideas comes from the private sector. So I think it's more appropriate to say that 2020 has seen the end of any semblance of consent of the governed and popular sovereignty. Because just think of the amount of power that's held by private, unelected bodies in these Western liberal regimes, completely out of the control of the populace. On the speech issue, 6 tech companies in the San Francisco Bay Area control the distribution of information across the globe. They have the power to censor the President of the United States. If Trump sent out a tweet that they didn't like, they could prevent the world from seeing it. For every crisis of the last year, it's impossible to underestimate just how involved the international media has been. From the COVID response, to the BLM race riots, to the aftermath of the US election, which I remind the YouTube censors I'm making no claims about, it's all been media-driven. These privately owned, unelected multinational media companies have the power to shape the populace's perception of reality. And then there's these NGOs who have been heavily involved in the events of the last year. like the World Economic Forum, who are now pushing for this so-called Great Reset agenda. Again, in these supposedly liberal regimes, the public has absolutely no say in this. So it should be abundantly clear by now that in the Western world, the people aren't in power, it's an international financial elite, whom are not beholden to the consent of the governed at all. So in 2020, we've seen these supposedly liberal regimes in the West absolutely trample upon their own principles of civil liberties and individual rights, the rule of law, free and fair elections, and popular sovereignty and the consent of the governed. And while I certainly have many criticisms of these values in principle, these regimes must be held to their own values, because these are their claims to legitimacy. And they're no longer even attempting to live up to their own values, no matter how flawed they may be. The liberal democratic system which America and other Western regimes uphold as their claim to legitimacy does not exist. In reality, they are ruled by a system of intersectional neoliberal anarcho-tyranny. And that's the lesson that should be learned from 2020. Now, the biggest mistake would be to double down on liberalism. Because the lesson should not be that the system under which the West is ruled today is not real liberalism because it's breaking all its own values. The classic liberal pointing out that it's not real liberalism at this point is the equivalent to the communists saying the USSR wasn't real communism. The reality that we are living in today is the result of the inherent flaws of the liberal system. It's been completely powerless in preventing its subversion over the past 75 years, and it actively stands in the way of any possible solutions. It's a worldview designed for a different societal context which no longer exists, and its incorrect assumptions about the world are coming back to bite. I've been saying this for years now, and in my opinion, what we've seen in 2020 is not exactly new. It's just the year that it all came into the open. So the takeaway from this year should be that the Western world now finds itself in a completely new context, where the past facade of liberal openness will disappear and the reality of technocratic, oligarchic, intersectional anarcho-tyranny will become apparent. And how to deal with this new context is the question we need to ask ourselves in 2021. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe. You can follow me on Twitter or Telegram, and if you'd like to support my work with a donation, you can do that too. All links are in the description. Thank you for listening. Till next time, endeavor.